Hello, and welcome back to Parley. This one was written by PistilWhip. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about the nature of communication, a last-minute parlay on what it means to communicate with someone. This one will be something of a return to form. Suppose there is a person locked inside a room. The door has a slit through which slips of paper can be passed. There's also a phrase book with questions and corresponding answers written in Chinese, or whatever language. It doesn't matter for this example. The person in the room does not know how to read that language. Now suppose that slips of paper with Chinese, say, questions are passed through the door. The person painstakingly finds the matching questions in the phrase book and copies the answers onto the slips of paper before returning them through the door. Assuming that the person did their job well, anyone from the outside will have the impression that the person inside the room understands Chinese and that the responses are intentional and meaningful. Does this constitute communication? The party outside the door has received appropriate answers to their questions, even though the person inside understands neither the questions nor the answers. More broadly, is mutual understanding necessary for communication? How do misunderstandings factor in? Does it matter whether any misunderstandings are intentional or not? That last one is kind of hard. Cool. This is a great topic. As has come up a lot of times before in Parley, people seem to like asking these communication ones, and maybe that's because I'm fun at answering them. Good fun at answering them? See, I don't think good. But one of the things I always bring up is that communication is tricky. You know, there even more than I do this in like a third of all Parley. I am going to say what, for the purposes of this Parley, is communication. And we're not going to answer that right away in this one. I think it's better to start by following the train of logic a little bit, and then I think it will become clear that defining at least two, possibly more, different forms of communication for this discussion is going to be very useful. So let's just follow it a little bit. Let's not overcomplicate things at first. Does it feel like this is communication? Now, I think that the natural response is to, at the start, to say, well, no, because there's no real understanding occurring between the two people. It seems like the person, you know, on the outside and the person on the inside are communicating, but they just have the false impression, the person on the outside has the false impression that they are communicating with the person on the inside. So communication, you might venture, well, it requires understanding. But I don't think that that adds up at all. When you look at it, a lot of the time, people communicate with each other, what we colloquially refer to as communicating. But there isn't understanding. They just wrongly believe that there is understanding going on. Though exactly what kind of misunderstanding is happening definitely makes a big difference. I think you're right to have added the misunderstandings point. So let's look at a situation like that. Let's break down people communicate. There is not actually understanding, but it feels like there is. Is the content of the misunderstanding meaningful? Is there something that feels like it is there that is valuable in that communication example that isn't really present in this thought experiment? Let's take a look. So, what situation will it be? Because a lot of them, it's weird. It's like the people are just sort of talking past each other. It's not that there isn't communication. I don't want to give away the lead too quickly that I'm going to go fine. I'm going to go on to say it's just that the people in the conversation kind of don't expect a sort of philosophical good communication. They expect what happens. And that is something different from this example. So, but I've got to give you an example. So like a small talk thing, I guess. This is a hard thing to give examples for because I go out of my way to structure my entire life to avoid all of these situations. But it would be, I'm like the worst person to ask for an example for this. But it would be something like, you know, if I say the weather has been really nice lately. And people say, well, but it's been raining. And I say, oh, well, but I like the rain. And they say, well, okay, you like the rain, but it's not that it's been nice lately. You're evoking a social construct that the weather being nice means it's sunny. Like that phrase usually means that. But I'm saying literally the weather has been nice lately, as in I'm claiming that the weather is objectively nicer when it's rainy, or I prefer the rain, and I'm saying the weather is nice means my social construct of it, mine alone. But the people talking, working through that discussion, aren't really having a misunderstanding in that example. I cannot give you an example of this thing, of course. Maybe it isn't as big of a problem as I thought. But obviously, what I mean is when people sort of talk through stuff in passing, in social situations or whatever, and they don't really dig into understanding. You know, a lot of people, if you said, this is fine, this will work, the weather is nice in passing and it's raining, they would say, yeah, it's been nice lately. You know, even though in their head they're thinking, or maybe subconsciously thinking, what the heck, it's raining. You know, like it's the hell it is, look outside. But to them, it's the understanding that the weather is nice is oh, that's a lot of things, and in that context it's probably interpreted as being the social thing you do where you say a small talk phrase to fill silence. You can see that one of the aspects of what we colloquially call communication seems to be quite disconnected from the meaning of the words being like understood, especially literally, by the other party. That doesn't seem to be involved in what we colloquially call communication most of the time. So I've waffled enough with my janky example. But I hope you can see my point. I think that how we talk about communication normally allows for a lot of things that this thought experiment bends over backwards to prevent. I think that makes sense. It's a useful thought experiment in that, you know, if you're passing slips through a door, I think people are intuitively tempted to say, well, if they're not seeing each other, well, then they're not communicating. But all the answers seem right. And so that sort of check where if you couldn't see the other person, you'd be kind of fact checking or paying closer attention to what was being said, has been sort of fulfilled. But in normal conversation, we often don't demand such a thing. Does that make sense? So I think that what the two examples illustrate is that the information being communicated, it definitely isn't important for a certain type of colloquial communication. In passing, how we use the word day to day, you would definitely call it communicating with someone in a sort of passing way. You certainly did communicate in some way if you small talk with someone and you speak right past each other. Or another funny example that comes to mind is when people say, how you doing? And you say like, good, how are you? And oftentimes the person on the other end will reflexively say, good, how are you? And sort of it just goes back and forth. I personally am guilty of, I often take it a fourth step. They say, hi, how are you? I say, good, how are you? And they say, good, how are you? And I say, good, how are you? I've done that before, once or twice, 15 times in my life. So I do personally think that sort of reflexiveness is important here. I think we've gotten far enough that it's worth pairing apart different kinds of communication. I said at least two. Let's take a look. So the first thing would be this sort of colloquial in passing, you communicated. Basically just meaning you talked with people and they got an expected result. But what does expected result mean? I guess it means two people who have signed an appreciably similar social contract speak to each other, communicate with each other somehow, doesn't have to be speech, and get a result that is in the social script, that's in the contract they signed. How about that? So this is why the communication that doesn't really have any understanding behind it, or involves reflexively saying things, is still communication in one sense, because the premise really isn't conveying information. The premise isn't really about that. The premise is that you know what is going to be communicated when you go in, and it's really more of a courtesy that you are actually communicating things. When you get a call from your senator or whatever, I don't know who has to raise money in politics, but a lot of people in politics have to spend a lot of time calling people raising money. If you get a call from these people, in that part of the world, in that sector, in that industry, you probably know you're going to be asked for money. You know what I mean? And they know they're going to ask you for money. And they small talk not really for any purpose, not to communicate information, not to create mutual understanding, just to kind of like re-sign the social contract is almost what it is. You go into a conference room abstractly in the conversation and sign the contract again and reaffirm it, I guess. We do that in real life, kind of. And then you say, okay, give me money for the campaign, you know? And they were always going to give you money unless you did something way outside of the normal or whatever. And you could argue that in that industry, being emotional and reacting to whether you should spend money on that like part of the political campaign or whatever based on your emotions is probably usually a mistake. You would be better at that job, I would imagine. I don't know, maybe this is wrong, but I would imagine you're better at that job if you don't change your mind about where to spend that budget based on how that conversation goes. You know what I mean? The point of the conversation is basically completely disconnected from communicating information. And I would argue that if you just kind of do the standard things offered up by at least the society I live in, you hardly ever have to communicate a way other than that. And therefore, the mode of communication that you're most keyed into really doesn't have anything to do with conveying new information. That's not really a thing that is done. Obviously, very few people probably always communicate that way. But it might not be very often that people would communicate that way. So definitely one form, I'm going to call it social contract reaffirmation. And we're not going to say that too many times in this parlay because that's a mouthful. But it'll be good to distinguish from the at least one other, maybe two other types. That's certainly one. And it feels like the thought experiment and just talking and passing and not understanding each other, well, they both seem to basically qualify. Though the mere fact that passing slips of paper under a door is such an irregular situation almost automatically disqualifies it from being a sort of social contract type of communication. I think most people would switch into a different mode of thinking about communicating at that point. So, like what? And is that communication in that mode? And what other forms of communication do people do when they're not basically autopiloting? Okay, let's take a look. Well, fairly obviously, we could draw one that's sort of like a philosophical ideal communication. The goal is to get the most information across the most effectively. Sure. Yeah, I mean, this is what I usually mean when I say communication. I mean very literally no frills communication. You get information across as effectively as possible. Now, I would include in this type of communication that it's almost like things from the social script type of communication are actually not communication now because their goal is not to convey information and they don't efficiently communicate information. They're taking up space that doesn't need to be there. If this was a piece of writing, these would be a waste of space that should be cut, should be edited out, I would suggest. And so, interestingly, this is kind of the opposite of the other communication. It's there sort of purely to, I almost want to say learn. It's for learning. And therefore, if you don't gain information that was somewhat unexpected, I'm not sure about that, it really isn't communication of this type. We'll call that philosophical communication, but it doesn't have to be about philosophy. How about we call it ideal communication instead? The idea is that this is essentially learning. It's basically teaching, I guess, and just using very direct teaching. You know, you're not really demonstrating physically by doing the activity. You're communicating with words or language the activity. I don't know. I don't see why demonstrating it wouldn't just be this as well. But we're not going to get too deep into the what can you do communication in indirect ways? How indirect can you go? I think the answer is yes, and you can go very far, and I would still count it as communication, but I don't think. Let's stick to this topic. So, okay, there's at least those two. I think that doing that communication is very hard. It's usually not very effective because if you're not prepared to do that type of communication, it's kind of anti-helpful. Just like the The social grace kind is anti-helpful if you're not keyed into doing that thing. I certainly pretty keenly experience in my day-to-day life that when you speak with people, they're in modes, sort of one or the other of these. And if they're in one mode, trying to communicate the other way will require some lead up. You sort of have to transition into that space. I often literally just ask if, a person I'm speaking to is willing to kind of get into thinking about something in a new way. Because if they're not, or if there isn't kind of that break there, them trying to go through the conversation using the social contract communication is not going to be fun for either of us. They're going to keep delaying the conversation with pleasantries, and I'm going to be trying to convey information I'm excited to hear their side on when they're not in the mode where you would do that, if that makes sense. So the kind of opposites, interesting. That's a little bit cleaner than I expected too. I think that another difference here is that misunderstandings are generally inconsequential in the social contract communication, but they are a direct failure for this sort of ideal communication. The goal of this communication is to avoid misunderstandings, I would argue. Not always to teach. It might also just be to explain that you have a perspective that is among perspectives that the person on the other end is aware of, but you want to explain exactly which one you have. It's not necessarily that you think they don't know. For example, something like two people very knowledgeable about politics. I don't know. There's been some political stuff in this parlay already, sure, barely, are communicating their exact positions on issues. Both people know basically all of the political positions that are out there so far. I suppose one of them may have a combination of political views that is novel, but you get the idea. Like, they know the issues about which they are discussing. So it's not like one of the people is going to say, well, I think, we should let people, control their own bodies or whatever. And the other person will go, I've never heard of that idea before. You know what I mean? Like, basically nobody has never heard of that idea before. But what does that mean? Well, okay, the person on the other end probably has a few ideas. You're saying that you're in favor of people being able to get abortions, for example. That sounds like what you mean. Is that what you mean? And they might be saying, well, I'm really talking more about just medication generally, though I suppose that's included, isn't it? Medicated abortions are a thing that exists. And so they're trying to hone in on exactly what thing they are referring to. Therefore, I would argue misunderstandings are basically the fail state. That's why the goal of this type of communication, I argue, isn't necessarily teaching. It is avoiding misunderstanding. It's accuracy, to put a word on it. Whereas misunderstandings almost don't exactly exist in the social contract communication, I would suggest. It's kind of like the whole point is to negate the problematic nature of misunderstandings, because the premise of the discussion isn't to communicate new information primarily, or it communicates new information only so generally that it's almost impossible to misunderstand. Like, in the conversation where you're asking for money for your political campaign, how much money or how the campaign is going. You could say these things, but how the campaign is going specifically is kind of a thing that doesn't exist. You know what I mean? Like, you could say how much money specifically, and that's basically impossible to misunderstand. You either literally lied or you told them the right number, and it's that number. They can't get the number wrong. And if you say how it's going emotionally, well, what does that even mean? You know what I mean? There's sort of isn't room for a misunderstanding. The thing is either so vague or so factual that there's really no need to explain. And I think that's true a lot of the time. It's not so much that people communicate in a mode where they're not focused on explanation. They're talking about subjects about which explanation doesn't make sense. It's not clearly useful to explain. I don't enjoy talking about these subjects. I like hearing people's vagaries, I guess, but I just feel like there's no point. If there is a factual answer, I can just look it up. Or again, you could email it to me or something. We don't need to communicate whichever communication we're talking about. So I think for the most part, the social contract communication is itself kind of suboptimal. I do not accept that there are clear reasons to do that, except that the other communication that is about understanding things, I am increasingly self-centeredly calling it ideal communication. But what are you gonna do? You knew what you were getting into when you asked this parlay. Come on, you're asking me about the subject of communication. You didn't think I was gonna say that anyway. Ideal communication. We're keeping the name. Uh, you're in a situation where it's sort of about doing things effectively. And so, of course, somebody who's interested in that is gonna argue that you could optimize out, social contract communication. But my point was, but it's hard to do all the time. It is difficult. The sort of social contract communication is designed to be automatic. It's not that it's easy. It's just sort of like what comes out is what comes out. If you signed the social contract, have been paying attention in the society you live in, the intention is that it just works. And if you do things sort of wrong, the system is meant to handle that a little bit, which is why it's pretty amazing. I'm often not very positive about people wanting to communicate that way, but that shouldn't be confused with at all not acknowledging that it's amazing. You know what I mean? The way people communicate in passing is an incredibly complex, kind of amazing thing that works and that things are function this way. It's not like nothing is being communicated a lot of the time. You know what I mean? It's just being communicated with a format that is shockingly unfocused on facts. When you'll note, while there is a lot of people not focusing on what is true or makes sense in human society, and that is a problem, there are lots of parts of human industry, for example, that you need to know facts. So a mode of communication that doesn't really focus on understanding working so consistently for a society like that's interesting. That's neat. I don't know. That's sort of scary, but anyway, I think it's kind of scary. And that's a deep-seated insecurity I have. But I still argue philosophically that even if I didn't have that deep-seated insecurity about people not understanding what's going on the other end of communication, uh, it would still be good to try to communicate in a way that was about, moving forward, rather than doing something that, should both parties be willing, we absolutely don't need to communicate about at all. We do not need to discuss this. I'm just going to give you the money for your campaign. You don't need to call. I don't want you to call. You don't want to call me. So let me just give you the money that makes sense, or I'll email you telling you that I analyzed the situation and it just doesn't really make sense, and you can't convince me emotionally. That would only work if I was bad at my job, and unfortunately, I'm not. I would like to give you money. You've been nice on the phone, whatever that means, but we're just not going to do that. And I bet some people do that sometimes, now and again. It sounds very unpleasant to need to ask people for money all the time. I would know. I structured my career to largely avoid needing to do that. Anyway, it's butts. What else do we have to say about communication? Let's read over the question at the end because I thought it was interesting. The particular thing that I wanted to put pressure on was, you said at the end, does it matter whether any misunderstandings are intentional or not? Yes, let's briefly explore the subject of lying or non-truthfulness in this discussion. What about if there is a misunderstanding, but it is a genuine misunderstanding? No, a false misunderstanding. A genuine misunderstanding is a mistake in ideal communication land. But what about a misunderstanding that was intended? I'm communicating with you, and we've established, or it's become clear through context, that the mode we are in is ideal communication. We are trying to understand things about each other. The goal is communicating, information correctly, informing or verifying information about each other, about some other thing. And I tell you something that I'm carefully structuring intentionally for you to misunderstand, but think that you understood it on purpose for some motive of mine. There's a couple different parts here. we have to focus on the misunderstanding being intentional. That is, I am lying to you, like in the very literal definition of lying. I'm purposefully telling you something untrue. But then there's also what is the motivation for doing that? Because I would argue that a literal lie, a factual incorrectness that you tell someone on purpose, that is there for the purpose of painting an accurate picture of the situation, is very different and definitely counts as the ideal communication thing. It furthers that goal. Whereas deception is something else. Let me give you an example. I think writing is a really good example. If you read a book and the narrative perspective kind of deceives you a little bit, says something that's literally not true about one of the characters, because it's from their perspective and they think that is true, and that's being done to convey their mental state to you. You will later have it clarified, or things will happen such as to demonstrate that that wasn't really true, so that will clarify it. It will later be clarified that that really isn't true, and that was just what the character thought, and you'll hopefully realize. But the purpose of it was you getting the intended understanding. You know what I mean? It wasn't really there to make you confused. It was there to paint an accurate picture using things that are temporarily, almost, not even permanently, not true. Or another example would be all the time you may have had the experience of thinking, well, if I describe this to someone, I describe what happened to me to someone, it's really, this detail is really confusing. What if I sort of simplify it only for the purpose of making it easier to understand the important part of what happened? And the detail is inconsequential. Like, I spilled ramen broth all over myself. Why did I spill ramen broth all over myself? Well, it was because I was writing the tip and, someone was passing by really quickly and they asked me if I had a nickel. And so I reached out to give them a nickel and my arms crossed over each other. And while trying to give them a nickel, I spilled the ramen broth on myself. What is this motion? And that's how it happened. I would be inclined when telling that story to say, well, I actually would just tell the whole story, but a lot of people would be inclined to say, oh, someone bumped into me. Like I bumped into someone, and that's why the ramen broth spilled on me. There are a lot of reasons that you might do that. For example, you just heard in my speech that I said someone bumped into me and then caught myself and went, no, we're not trying to make it their fault. The purpose of this is just to paint the picture in a more simple way. So let's just make it my fault. That's better by default. I think that's a healthier perspective. I bumped into someone, not someone bumped into me. I'm not trying to blame them. That's not the focus here. I don't want the person on the other end to go, oh, like that was so rude of them. No, that doesn't matter. So let's just make it my fault. And then they won't comment on that part. And the point is to just tell people that ramen broth spilled on me for no particular reason. So simplifying the story and eliminating it being other people's fault, just to prevent any confusion, seems sensible. You see what I mean? I would argue that's really not that's not a misunderstanding anyway, but like that's not the same as lying exactly, because the goal is to more accurately paint the subject that we're talking about. You're just removing details that are truly irrelevant to the situation. Now, I would personally just tell people about the nickel hand over the other hand thing. I don't know what was going on there, but that I would just tell people that. But that's not the same as a misunderstanding that's unintentional. Well, yeah. So, I mean, there's a different thing, which would be if you said, uh, someone bumped into me, you've unintentionally caused the person on the other end to misunderstand that you're annoyed because someone bumped into you and made you spill ramen broth on yourself. When the focus was meant to be about the ramen broth spilling on you due to an accident, your way of communicating has unintentionally created a misunderstanding, a potential misunderstanding. That the reason you're talking about this is because you were slighted by someone else, like something bad happened to you, but that's really not, or because of someone else. Someone else wronged you, but that isn't meant to be the focus. So sure, I think that matters. I would allow it's not really a misunderstanding, but like a thing that is not true, that gives a person a different idea of the situation on the surface, but which is there intentionally to help them understand more accurately. This isn't a great example. Getting a genuine example of a situation where you're intentionally getting someone to um, you're unintentionally having someone misunderstand the situation. I don't know. Like, I'm getting a little bit tangled up on that. I would like to briefly add as an endpoint, because I'm sure if I just go on about this, I'm not going to be able to effectively give a better example. I need to accept I can't do better than that. Um, if you were to say, someone bumped into me, and the person on the other end went, oh, like that's annoying. Like, well, they should have apologized or helped you clean up or something. They just walked away. Now, what if you are annoyed because you feel like someone else imposed this misfortune on you? It's the same situation as before, and you kind of oversimplified it. But you did that because subconsciously you are upset because you feel like someone bumped into you. Even though that really isn't exactly what happened, it did involve someone else. And in your head, you're thinking, well, it's because they asked me for a nickel. Who cares about the nickel? Them getting a nickel wasn't more important than me having dry clothes. You know, buh, that this is silly. And so it is their fault. Maybe you think internally. You see what I mean? Does it matter whether you know whether the misunderstanding is intentional or not? You, the communicator, not the person on the receiving end. Um, I think no. I think if you are consciously communicating genuinely, like you're saying what you would say, which is kind of hard to know, it's okay if you don't know for sure. Because if it isn't, that would be like saying that you can't communicate effective information if you don't know everything. You have to be a perfectly enlightened Buddha floating in the ether, or you cannot communicate effectively because you may not know something. That has to be allowed. So I think it is also surprisingly unimportant that communication contain verifiable truth. How about that? Uh, Even when the goal is to communicate information, to pursue truth, rather than to kind of affirm things in the social contract reaffirmation thing. Because usually, I think, the goal of communication is just to further things. The goal of humanity has been called to continue. And I think that that's true of both modes of communication. Where they have a thing in common is that they are both about keeping the status quo going, maybe, or moving forward to a new one. But the goal is to keep moving. You know, it's a tool that we generally use for things outside of its own end. We're not just talking to talk, even if it feels like we are. At least on my end, I generally feel like, well, I'm doing this to understand something better and work through something. I wasn't able to pair apart the misunderstanding intentionality or not thing as well as I thought. That could have made it more into the quick show notes that I take before these parlay. I was underprepared for that point, so that was something I learned. Maybe I overprepared for the beginning where I knew what I had to say, and I should uh, or it would benefit me to not so much in the beginning prepare because I generally know what I have to say and do it more toward the end. It's harder to speak eloquently or coherently about a subject after talking for a half hour straight as well. So maybe I could use the help more toward the end. I've thought that before. But anyway, the point is, I at least am not talking about this just to talk. Well, it is my job. Thank you for your support, by the way, your patronage. I happen to know PistilWhip, you got this gifted to you. Um, but the point I'm trying to make is that I generally feel that communication that is for either of these modes would need to be for some end, or the end doesn't have to be a destination. Just like there's a direction you want to go in. There's a win state is what I was trying to get out. My brain was thinking about, oh no, like what about the prospect of just talking for no particular motivation, with no win state in sight, where things have gone well if they go like this, or poorly if they go like that. A nightmare, an absolute nightmare. I mean, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that I always have to judge whether a conversation went well or poorly. a lot of the time, the the point of the conversation to me is something that basically can't go poorly, like meeting somebody new. There are really no stakes here. I just want to get to know them. No matter what happens, I've learned things about them, and therefore, it's sort of already a win. But there is like a point to the conversation. It's just not a failable goal. You see what I mean? So I don't know. I mean, that's how I think of it anyway. Um, Behavior truly not motivated by any possible gain sounds kind of impossible. But I mean, obviously, it would be like people that have a weaker reason for communicating, that are just talking to fill the silence or something. They don't really need to reaffirm a social contract, and they're not trying to pursue truth or whatever. They're just sort of filling the space with noise. I feel like one could turn on a show instead. I don't know. It doesn't seem entirely necessary to me. There's lots of good things to talk about. Okay, that's all I got. This was a really interesting one. As usual, Pistol Whip, while uh, I can't encourage you to submit your parlay late, you sang last minute parlay about really well thought out subject. I mean, it's pretty good. I'm not going to encourage you to submit them late in the month, but they're coming out good. I don't know. You're on a roll.